How could a fiery, ambitious aristocrat, a man literally pulsating with a hunger for power and an unshakable belief in his own destiny, find his soulmate in a reserved, profoundly intelligent beauty from a family teetering on the edge of social and financial ruin? This was not merely a question of differing personalities, but a clash of worlds within the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of Edwardian England. He was a scion of the illustrious Spencer-Churchill family, the grandson of a duke, a celebrated war correspondent, and a recklessly daring young politician already infamous in the hallowed halls of Parliament for his audacity. She, in stark contrast, was the daughter of a family whose aristocratic pedigree was overshadowed by whispers of scandal, crippling debt, and a pervasive sense of instability. The question that hung in the perfumed air of London's high society was not just how they could fall for one another, but how such an improbable union could possibly endure the immense pressures that his monumental ambition and her precarious circumstances would inevitably create. It was a story that seemed destined for a brief, passionate flameout, yet it would become the bedrock of a partnership that would not only survive but actively forge the course of modern history, proving that the most resilient alliances are often forged not from similarity, but from the complementary strengths of two profoundly different, yet perfectly matched, souls. This is the story of that unlikely union, a bond so powerful and multifaceted that it would become the central stabilizing force through some of the most turbulent decades the world has ever known. It is a narrative that transcends simple romance, delving into the intricate mechanics of a political and personal partnership that weathered the brutal storms of 2 world wars, the crushing disappointments of political exile, the private agony of personal tragedy, and the relentless soul-crushing weight of public duty. It is the chronicle of how Winston Churchill, the Lion of Britain, a man of titanic energies and equally colossal flaws, drew his most essential strength, his most incisive counsel, and his most profound comfort from Clementine Hozier, the woman who was not merely his wife, but his anchor, his conscience, and his most unwavering ally. Their story is an exploration of how personal love and public life can become so deeply intertwined that they are functionally inseparable, creating a formidable force that would guide a nation through its darkest hour and leave an indelible mark on the very fabric of the 20th century. Winston Leonard Spencer-Churchill, born into the very heart of the British aristocracy at the magnificent Blenheim Palace, was a force of nature from his earliest days. As the grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, privilege was his birthright, but it was his own ferocious ambition and an almost messianic sense of self-belief that propelled him forward. He was not a man who waited for destiny to call. He charged headlong to meet it, often with a reckless disregard for convention and a sublime confidence that bordered on arrogance. His early career was a whirlwind of action and self-promotion. A cavalry officer in the dusty plains of India, a daring war correspondent escaping a Boer prisoner-of-war camp in South Africa, and by his mid-20s, a member of Parliament. In the staid, formal world of Westminster, he was an electrifying and often irritating presence. His impatience with procedure, his soaring rhetorical style, and his immense unabashed desire for power were already making waves, marking him in the eyes of allies and enemies alike as a man who was unequivocally destined for greatness or an equally spectacular fall from grace. In stark, dramatic contrast to Winston's gilded world, Clementine Hozier's life was a study in quiet resilience against a backdrop of genteel poverty and scandalous uncertainty. Her ethereal beauty and sharp, discerning intellect were a deceptive veneer, concealing a childhood and young adulthood marked by profound instability. Though she was the granddaughter of the Earl of Airlie, her aristocratic blood offered little protection from the harsh realities of her family's circumstances. Her mother, the beautiful but notoriously flighty Lady Blanche Hozier, was a compulsive gambler whose debts constantly threatened to pull the family under. Even more unsettling were the persistent whispered rumors surrounding Clementine's true paternity. with many in their social circle believing her biological father was not Henry Hozier, but the celebrated horseman and aristocrat Bay Middleton. This constant financial precarity and the shadow of social scandal forced Clementine to cultivate a steely inner core, a quiet dignity, and a sharp, observant intelligence that became her primary defense against the unpredictability of her world. She learned to be watchful, cautious, and deeply self-reliant, qualities that would prove essential in her future life. Their paths first crossed at a glittering ball in 1904, but the encounter was a spectacular failure. Winston, the usually loquacious and self-assured politician, was rendered uncharacteristically silent and awkward, utterly captivated by Clementine's beauty but unable to string together a coherent sentence. He failed to make any impression, and the moment passed. 4 years later, however, fate intervened. They were reintroduced at a small, elegant dinner party hosted by Clementine's great-aunt. This time, the spark was undeniable. Winston, older and more established, was no longer a tongue-tied admirer. He was utterly smitten, and he launched a courtship with the same speed, intensity, and strategic focus that he applied to a military campaign. He saw in her not just a beautiful face, but a soul of fire and an intellect that could match his own. He was determined to win her, and he pursued her with a relentless energy that was both overwhelming and deeply romantic, recognizing instantly that he had found a woman of unique substance and character. Amidst the relentless, churning chaos of history, a chaos that their lives seemed to attract and amplify, how is a family built and sustained? For Winston and Clementine Churchill, the very concept of a private life was a luxury they could rarely afford. Their home was never just a home. It was, by necessity, a political headquarters, a social stage, a sanctuary from public assault, and a command center for a life lived at the epicenter of world events. This constant intersection of public duty and private existence created an environment of immense unrelenting pressure, not only for them, but also for the children they were raising under the long and often overwhelming shadow of a father whose life belonged not just to them, but to the nation and the world. The births of their first 3 children, Diana in 1909, the rambunctious Randolph in 1911, and the artistic Sarah in 1914, brought immense joy and a new dimension of love into their lives. However, these joys were invariably accompanied by immense and unique challenges. Winston's career was an all-consuming vortex of activity, demanding his attention at all hours of the day and night. His work as a cabinet minister, his endless writing, and his constant political maneuvering left precious little time for the traditional duties of fatherhood. Consequently, the primary and often sole burden of parenting fell squarely upon Clementine's capable shoulders. She was the one who managed the nurseries, hired the governesses, dealt with childhood illnesses, and provided the day-to-day emotional stability that their larger-than-life father often could not. While Winston loved his children deeply, his love was often that of a distant, benevolent monarch, whereas Clementine's was the constant, hands-on presence that truly shaped their upbringing. In their turbulent and often financially precarious world, Clementine was the indispensable anchor. She was far more than a society hostess. She was the chief operating officer of the Churchill enterprise. With a masterful hand, she managed their multiple households, from their London residence to their country estates, ensuring they ran with an efficiency that belied their often strained finances. She became an expert at stretching a budget, juggling creditors, and maintaining the appearance of effortless aristocratic life on an income that was frequently unpredictable. Simultaneously, she orchestrated a vibrant and politically essential social life, hosting a constant stream of influential figures from the worlds of politics, art, and literature. She created the environments, the elegant dinners, the weekend house parties, that were crucial to Winston's ability to build alliances, gather information, and advance his political ambitions. She was the unshakable, practical core around which his chaotic, brilliant life revolved. Yet, the relentless pressure of her myriad responsibilities and the emotional toll of their tumultuous life inevitably took a heavy toll. The most devastating blow came in 1921 with the death of their fourth child, Marigold. At the tender age of 2, the little girl, affectionately known as the Duckadilly, contracted septicemia and died within a matter of days. The loss was a staggering, unimaginable blow that shattered them both. For Clementine, who had been Marigold's primary caregiver, the grief was compounded by a profound sense of guilt and helplessness. This intensely private tragedy, more than any public crisis or political defeat, tested the absolute limits of their union. It was a shared wound that would never fully heal, a quiet, sorrowful undercurrent in their lives that bound them together in a way that even their greatest public triumphs could not. Through the crucible of political failure, financial anxiety, and devastating personal loss, Clementine's role in Winston's life was definitively forged. She was not merely important, she had proven herself to be absolutely essential. She was the stabilizing force that allowed his chaotic genius to function and flourish. She created a domestic world that was orderly enough to serve as a secure launchpad for his forays into the disorderly world of politics. She managed the practical details of life so that his mind could be free to grapple with the monumental issues of state. Her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering devotion ensured not only his emotional and psychological survival during his darkest moments, but also created the necessary conditions for his eventual, spectacular return to the pinnacle of power. She was the silent architect of the scaffolding that supported his great public life. The Great War was finally won, but the hard-won peace brought with it a new, and in many ways more complex, battle for Winston Churchill. Victory on the international stage did not translate into stability or popularity at home. The post-war world was a landscape of economic turmoil, social unrest, and shifting political allegiances. In this volatile environment, Churchill's career became a roller coaster of controversial appointments and high-profile blunders. Why did the celebrated war leader, a man credited with key innovations in the victory, find himself so frequently at odds with the public mood, a political outcast constantly fighting against the tide of popular opinion? The answer lay in his inability to adapt his wartime mindset to the challenges of peacetime, a flaw that would lead him to make some of the most disastrous decisions of his career. In the turbulent years following the war, his political journey was erratic and unpredictable. Having served in a coalition government, he controversially switched his allegiance back to the Conservative Party, a move that many saw as opportunistic. His most significant and damaging role during this period came when he was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924. In a decision that would haunt his reputation for decades, he made the fateful choice in 1925 to return Britain to the gold standard at its pre-war parity. The policy was a catastrophic miscalculation, dramatically overvaluing the pound, crippling British exports, and leading to widespread deflation, wage cuts, and massive unemployment. It was a primary cause of the 1926 general strike and inflicted immense hardship on the working classes, cementing his reputation in many quarters as an enemy of the common man. Throughout these turbulent times, as he lurched from one political firestorm to another, Clementine's role evolved beyond that of a mere supporter. She became his sharpest, most astute, and often his most fearless critic. She did not blindly endorse his decisions. On the contrary, she frequently challenged his most risky and ill-conceived ideas. She had a grounded, pragmatic perspective that served as a vital counterbalance to his often reckless, romantic impulses. When his self-confidence swelled into arrogance, she was the one who could gently, or sometimes forcefully, bring him back down to earth. She was his essential moral and political compass, the voice of reason that could penetrate the formidable armor of his self-belief. Her counsel was not always welcomed in the heat of the moment, but it was almost always heeded in the end. Her political insight was not merely intuitive, it was born of diligent and meticulous effort. She made it her business to be as well informed as he was. She conscientiously read every major speech he wrote, every government paper he brought home, and every important piece of correspondence. Her feedback was not vague encouragement. It was sharp, intelligent, and specific. She would point out logical flaws in his arguments, question the wisdom of a particular policy, or warn him about the political ramifications of a provocative phrase. Winston, though famously impatient with criticism from others, came to depend on her judgment absolutely. He might argue and bluster initially, but he knew her intellect was formidable and her loyalty was absolute. Their partnership thus evolved from a personal romance into a powerful symbiotic political alliance, where her shrewd analysis was as critical to his success as his own soaring oratory. What happens when a man's greatest sanctuary, his refuge from the pressures of the world, is simultaneously the source of his greatest financial and domestic anxieties? For Winston and Clementine Churchill, their beloved country home, Chartwell, was precisely this paradox. It was the physical embodiment of Winston's romantic soul and creative spirit, but for Clementine, it was a constant, draining battleground between her husband's grand passions and the stark, unforgiving realities of their financial situation. The story of Chartwell is, in many ways, the story of their marriage, a magnificent, inspiring, yet perpetually demanding enterprise that required constant effort and sacrifice to maintain. Purchased in a somewhat dilapidated state in 1922, Chartwell, a sprawling estate nestled in the rolling hills of Kent, quickly became Winston's personal heaven on earth. It was here that he could truly escape the suffocating confines of Westminster politics and indulge his myriad passions. He poured his immense energies into transforming the property, becoming an amateur architect, landscape designer, and even a manual laborer. He built walls with his own hands, earning a membership in the Bricklayers' Union. He constructed dams to create vast lakes and ponds, and spent countless hours in his studio, painting landscapes with a skill that was far more than amateurish. Chartwell was the place where he could recharge his soul, connect with the English earth he loved so deeply, and find the mental space to write the books that would secure both his literary reputation and his financial future. But for Clementine, Winston's pastoral paradise was often a source of immense and unrelenting stress. The initial purchase price was high, and the costs of renovation and expansion seemed endless, far outstripping their often unreliable income, which was largely dependent on Winston's writing. She was the one who had to manage the large staff, pay the mounting bills, and constantly worry about how to keep their heads above the rising tide of debt that Chartwell created. She saw it not as a romantic sanctuary, but as a voracious beast that consumed their resources and threatened their financial stability. Her pragmatic nature clashed constantly with his cavalier attitude towards money. While he was dreaming up new construction projects, she was agonizing over the household budget, trying to create a stable and secure home on a foundation of precarious financial footing. Despite the anxieties it caused, Chartwell was undeniably more than just a home. It was a vital stage for Winston's public and private life. It was here, in the idyllic Kent countryside, that he entertained a dazzling array of influential guests. Figures like Charlie Chaplin, T.E. Lawrence, and Frederick Lindemann were frequent visitors, engaging in sparkling dinner conversations that would often last late into the night. It was also at Chartwell that he held crucial political meetings during his years in the wilderness, strategizing with the small band of supporters who shared his views. The house was the vibrant center of his world, a place where his roles as a politician, writer, painter, and family man all converged. It was the indispensable backdrop for the life of one of the 20th century's most consequential figures, made possible only by Clementine's stressful but ultimately successful management. While a nation, scarred by the memory of the Great War, desperately hoped for lasting peace, one man saw the terrifying nightmare that was gathering on the horizon. He saw the dark clouds of tyranny and aggression massing over Europe and felt, with an unshakable and terrifying certainty, that a second, even more catastrophic conflict was inevitable. How did Winston Churchill, a politician already considered by many to be a relic of a past age, become a lone, prophetic voice, crying out against the rising tide of Nazi Germany. How did he find the courage to risk what remained of his political career, his public standing, and his personal peace to warn a world that was determinedly, willfully refusing to listen? His journey through this period was one of profound political isolation, but also one of his greatest moral triumphs. In the 1930s, the dominant political doctrine in Britain and much of Europe was appeasement. The trauma of World War I, with its millions dead and a generation shattered, was deeply seared into the collective consciousness. Political leaders like Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the vast majority of the public were desperate to avoid another war at almost any cost. They believed that by making rational concessions and engaging in diplomatic negotiation, they could satisfy the grievances of dictators like Adolf Hitler and preserve the peace. This policy was rooted in a genuine desire for peace, but it was also founded on a catastrophic misjudgment of the Nazi regime's boundless ambition and ruthless nature. Churchill, from his position on the backbenches of Parliament, saw the rising threat of Hitler not as a conventional political problem to be managed, but as a mortal danger to civilization itself. Drawing on his deep knowledge of history and his extensive network of informants in Germany, he passionately and relentlessly denounced the policy of appeasement. He delivered powerful, detailed speeches in the House of Commons, warning of the rapid pace of German rearmament and the brutal expansionist ideology that drove the Nazi Party. His warnings, however, were widely dismissed. He was mocked in the press and derided by his political opponents as a bitter, resentful warmonger, a man obsessed with conflict who was trying to drag the country into another unnecessary war. He was politically isolated, his voice a lonely and unwelcome intrusion into the prevailing consensus of peace at any price. These were his wilderness years, a prolonged period of profound frustration and political impotence. He was out of power, his influence at its lowest ebb, forced to watch helplessly as the government made one concession after another to Hitler, from the reoccupation of the Rhineland to the annexation of Austria. It was a deeply painful and demoralizing time for a man of his immense energies and patriotism. He felt like the mythical Cassandra, blessed with the gift of prophecy but cursed, never to be believed. He channeled his frustration into his writing, producing his monumental A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. But his mind was always on the looming threat from across the Channel, a threat that he felt in his very bones. Throughout this lonely and difficult struggle, Clementine was his fiercest and most steadfast defender. She shared his deep alarm at the growing power and aggression of Nazi Germany, and was one of the few who fully understood the stakes. When the storm of criticism against him was at its most intense, her belief in his judgment and his cause was an unbreakable shield. She provided the emotional and intellectual reinforcement he desperately needed. In moments when even his iron resolve began to waver under the weight of public scorn and political isolation, it was her quiet, unwavering conviction that reinforced his own. She was not just a comforting presence, she was his partner in a deeply unpopular but historically vital cause, her faith in him a beacon of light during the darkest days of his political exile. As the bombs of the Luftwaffe began to fall on Poland, and an entire continent trembled on the brink of abyss, the one man who had been shunned, ridiculed, and dismissed as a warmonger was suddenly the only one who seemed to possess the clarity and resolve the moment demanded. His dire prophecies, once derided, were now being horrifyingly fulfilled. How did Winston Churchill, a political exile in his own party, rise from the ashes of his wilderness years to become Britain's defiant, indomitable wartime leader? His ascent was not the result of political maneuvering or personal ambition, but of the brutal, inexorable logic of events, a nation in mortal peril turning to the only man who had consistently told them the unwelcome truth. With Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the subsequent British declaration of war on Germany, the political landscape shifted overnight. Churchill's years of warning against the Nazi threat, which had made him a pariah, now made him indispensable. On the very day that war was declared, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had no choice but to recall him to the government, appointing him once again to his old post as First Lord of the Admiralty. The news sent a surge of confidence through the nation. The famous naval signal, "Winston is back," flashed around the fleet, a clear sign that Britain was now serious about fighting the war. His warnings, for so long dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter has-been, were now seen for what they were: the chillingly accurate predictions of a true statesman. By May 1940, the situation had become catastrophic. The phony war was over, and Hitler's forces were storming across Western Europe with terrifying speed, using their blitzkrieg tactics to overwhelm Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The French army was collapsing, and the British Expeditionary Force was in full retreat towards the coast. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement lay in utter ruins, his leadership discredited, and his government on the verge of collapse. Britain was facing its darkest hour, standing alone against the seemingly unstoppable Nazi war machine, with the prospect of invasion looming. The nation was in desperate need of a leader who was not a diplomat, but a fighter. The political crisis came to a head in the House of Commons. Following a disastrous debate on the Norwegian campaign, it became clear that Chamberlain had lost the confidence of Parliament and the country. The choice for his successor came down to two men: Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill. Halifax was the establishment's choice, but he was reluctant to take the role. The mood of the nation, and indeed of the King, George VI, recognized that only one man possessed the spirit, the experience, and the iron will to lead the country in such a perilous time. On May 10, 1940, the same day Hitler launched his invasion of France, King George VI summoned Winston Churchill to Buckingham Palace and asked him to form a government and become Prime Minister. In his very first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister, Churchill offered no false hope or easy promises. He laid out the stark reality of the situation with brutal honesty. "I have nothing to offer," he famously declared, "but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." It was a message of grim resolve, but it was precisely what the British people needed to hear. He rejected any thought of negotiation or surrender, uniting the nation with his defiant, indomitable spirit. Through his powerful, electrifying radio broadcasts, his voice became the soundtrack of British resistance, broadcasting a single, unshakable message to his people and to the world. No matter the cost, Britain would fight on. Britain would never surrender. He embodied the collective will of a nation determined to survive. As Winston stepped into the role of wartime leader, Clementine stepped onto the public stage in a way she never had before. She understood that her role now extended far beyond being a prime minister's wife. She had to become a symbol of national resilience. She threw herself into war work, traveling across the country to tour bombed-out cities, offering comfort and encouragement to the victims of the Blitz. She visited munitions factories, speaking to the women who were working tirelessly to supply the war effort. With her natural grace, quiet dignity, and genuine compassion, she became a beloved and reassuring figure, the steadfast matriarch of a nation under siege. Her public presence was the perfect complement to Winston's bulldog defiance, a visible representation of the quiet, unbreakable spirit of the British people. When the entire world is engulfed in the flames of war, when the daily reality is one of existential threat and unimaginable stress, how does a marriage, any marriage, survive? The pressures of leadership in peacetime are immense. In wartime, they are almost beyond human endurance. For Winston and Clementine Churchill, the Second World War was not an abstract political event, but a daily lived reality that invaded every aspect of their lives. Under the constant threat of military defeat and the psychological strain of the bombing of London, their 57-year partnership was tested as never before, forcing them to draw upon their deepest reserves of strength, loyalty, and mutual understanding. The nightly bombing of London during the Blitz, which began in September 1940, brought the war directly to their doorstep. The wail of the air raid sirens and the percussive thud of exploding bombs became the grim soundtrack to their lives. Rather than retreating to the deepest, safest shelters, Clementine and Winston often chose to watch the destruction from the rooftop of number 10 Downing Street or the nearby annex. This was not a reckless act of bravado. It was a profound gesture of solidarity. They were determined to share the danger and the fear with their fellow citizens, to demonstrate that the leadership of the country was standing with the people in their hour of trial. This shared experience of immediate mortal danger forged an even deeper bond between them. Beyond the shared public danger, their private anxieties were immense and deeply personal. The war was not just a matter of maps and strategies. It was a matter of family. Their only son, Randolph, was serving on active duty in the military, often in dangerous theaters of operation. Their daughters, Diana, Sarah, and Mary, also served in uniform in various capacities. Like millions of other families across Britain, they lived with the constant, gnawing fear that a telegram could arrive at any moment, bearing the worst possible news. Every casualty report, every announcement of a sunken ship or a lost battalion, carried the potential for devastating personal tragedy. This constant private dread was a heavy burden they carried beneath the weight of their public responsibilities. Clementine, who had been deeply wounded by the 1945 election defeat, wholeheartedly encouraged this shift in his focus. She was deeply concerned about his health after the immense strain of the war and worried that the bitterness of his political defeat might consume him. She hoped that a quieter life, dedicated to his writing and his beloved painting at Chartwell, might offer him a measure of peace. She saw the value in him securing his legacy through literature, away from the daily cut and thrust of frontline politics. While she continued to support his political work, she gently nudged him towards the role of the elder statesman and historian, hoping to shield him from the inevitable further disappointments of a political career. Could the old lion, now well into his 70s, roar one last time and reclaim the power he felt was unjustly stripped from him? In the general election of 1951, Winston Churchill achieved a remarkable political comeback. The public, weary of post-war austerity under the Labour government, narrowly voted the Conservatives back into power. But this second premiership would be profoundly different from the first. It was not a time of existential crisis and glorious defiance, but of managing a nation in decline and grappling with the complexities of the nuclear age. This time his greatest and most relentless battle would not be fought against a foreign dictator or a political rival, but against his own failing health and the inexorable advance of age, a secret struggle that would be carefully and masterfully concealed from the public eye. Leading the Conservatives to a narrow victory, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister for a second time in October 1951, at the advanced age of 76. His formidable mind, his vast experience, and his global prestige were still largely intact, and his return was hailed by many as a steadying hand in a turbulent world defined by the Korean War and the Cold War. However, it was clear to those closest to him that his physical powers were visibly waning. He tired more easily, his hearing was failing, and his once prodigious capacity for work had diminished significantly. The world had also changed dramatically since his wartime premiership. The decline of the British Empire was accelerating, the Cold War was intensifying, and Britain's role as a global superpower was being challenged by the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union. He was, in many ways, a leader from another era, grappling with a new and unfamiliar set of problems with diminished energy. The hidden crisis of his second term erupted on the evening of June 23, 1953. While hosting a dinner for the Italian Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street, Churchill suffered a severe stroke. It paralyzed the left side of his body, and for a time it was feared he might not survive the night. The event was a potential constitutional crisis. Had the true extent of his incapacitation become public knowledge, it would have created a power vacuum, triggered panic in the financial markets, and forced his immediate resignation, potentially bringing down the government. A plan of masterful concealment was immediately put into motion by a small, loyal inner circle who prioritized the stability of the country over constitutional norms. At the heart of this conspiracy of silence was Clementine, along with his doctor, Lord Moran, his private secretary, Jock Colville, and his son-in-law, Christopher Soames. With remarkable efficiency and ruthlessness, they orchestrated the cover-up. They informed the cabinet only that the Prime Minister was suffering from exhaustion and needed a complete rest. They controlled all access to him, prevented any leaks to the press, and issued vague, reassuring bulletins about his condition. The newspapers, operating under a gentleman's agreement of deference to the Prime Minister's privacy that would be unthinkable today, collaborated in the deception, reporting only the official story. The public was kept completely in the dark about how close the nation was to losing its leader. Clementine's role in this deception was absolutely paramount. She transformed from the Prime Minister's wife into his fierce, unwavering protector and chief nurse. She personally supervised his nursing, first at Downing Street and then in secret at their country home, Chartwell, where he was moved to recuperate away from the prying eyes of London. She managed the constant flow of official papers, deciding what was important enough to show him and what could be handled by his staff. She masterfully shielded his profound vulnerability from the outside world, understanding that she was protecting not only the man she loved, but also the stability of the government he led. Her strength and discretion during this critical period were extraordinary, a final dramatic demonstration of her indispensable role in his political life. Against all odds, he made a remarkable recovery and returned to his duties, his secret safe. All great political careers, no matter how monumental, must eventually come to an end. But for a man like Winston Churchill, who had lived at the very center of world events for more than half a century, a man for whom power was as essential as oxygen, how does one simply walk away? The act of retirement is never easy for such figures, but for Churchill, it was a profound and painful duty. A final, reluctant letting go of the reins of power that had defined his very existence. His farewell to power was not a single event, but a slow, poignant process of withdrawal from the stage he had so completely dominated for so long, a stage he could not imagine existing without him upon it. By early 1955, the political and physical realities could no longer be ignored. His health, though he had made a remarkable recovery from the 1953 stroke, was clearly failing. A series of minor strokes had further impaired his speech and mobility. His grasp on the complex details of government was slipping, and his colleagues, including his long-suffering heir apparent Anthony Eden, were growing increasingly anxious for him to step down. The pressure, both from within his party and from the press, became immense and undeniable. He was a lion in winter, his roar fading, his strength ebbing away, and he knew that to cling to power any longer would be a disservice to the country he loved. With a profoundly heavy heart, and after much gentle but firm persuasion from Clementine and his closest advisors, he finally accepted the inevitable. On April 5, 1955, after a glittering farewell dinner at 10 Downing Street, attended by Queen Elizabeth II, Winston Churchill tendered his resignation as Prime Minister. He left office not because of a political defeat, but because of the simple, unbeatable advance of time. The transition to private life was immediate and profoundly difficult. The sudden silence after decades of crisis and command was deafening. The absence of the red dispatch boxes filled with state secrets, the constant flow of information, and the sense of purpose that came with leading the nation plunged him into a deep and familiar depression. The man who had once commanded armies and guided the fate of nations now struggled to command his own days. Once again, in this final twilight chapter of his public life, Clementine was his anchor. She understood the immense psychological void that retirement had created, and she dedicated herself to filling it. She organized their lives, planning extensive travels to sunnier climates where he could relax and paint, often on the French Riviera as a guest of wealthy friends. She filled their days at home with a carefully managed schedule of social engagements and family gatherings, ensuring he was never left alone with his dark thoughts for too long. She gently, skillfully guided him through the difficult transition from world leader to private citizen, helping him to find a measure of peace and contentment in a world that he no longer led, but had irrevocably shaped. Her final great service to him was to make his retirement not an ending, but a gentle, dignified closing of a historic chapter. When a giant of history falls, the entire world seems to hold its breath. Winston Churchill's final years were a slow, quiet, and poignant fading, a gradual withdrawal from the world he had once bestrode like a colossus. But his death, when it came, would trigger an unprecedented global farewell, a final, magnificent tribute, not just to a British statesman, but to the man who was widely seen as the savior of Western civilization itself. His passing marked the definitive end of an era, the end of the British Empire, the end of the age of European dominance, and the world paused to acknowledge the loss of one of its most monumental figures. In the decade following his retirement, his health steadily and progressively declined, marked by a series of further strokes that weakened him physically and slowly dimmed the brilliant fire of his mind. He spent his days in quiet retirement, dividing his time between his London home at Hyde Park Gate and his beloved Chartwell. He resigned his seat in Parliament in 1964, ending a political career that had spanned over 6 decades. He was surrounded by his devoted family, but he became increasingly frail and detached, a shadow of the dynamic figure he had once been. The great mind that had composed immortal speeches and devised grand strategies was slowly, heartbreakingly, falling silent. On January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, Winston Churchill died. By a decree of the Queen, he was accorded a state funeral, an extraordinary honor. The event was a massive, solemn, and deeply moving spectacle, a final solemn salute from a world that recognized its immense debt to him. Clementine, his partner of 57 years, outlived him by 12 years, dedicating her remaining time to preserving his legacy and her own charitable work, a final testament to their incredible history-shaping partnership.